For years, India mastered a delicate illusion. When foreign policy stumbled, domestic success filled the gap. When diplomacy strained, growth numbers spoke louder. When the world questioned, New Delhi pointed inward and moved on. That illusion is now cracking. In 2026, India will no longer have the luxury of separating its global posture from its domestic reality. Foreign policy, politics, and the economy are beginning to collide, not gradually, but all at once. And when that happens, even a fast-growing nation can feel suddenly constrained. The warning signs are already here. Tariffs that haven't fully bitten, alliances that look solid on paper but brittle in practice, summits that project confidence, even as leverage quietly erodes. If you want to understand where India is heading next and why the old playbook may no longer work, stay with me. Because what lies ahead is not a single crisis, but a systemic shift. And once systems change, they don't ask for permission. To see why this moment matters, we first need to clarify what exactly is now at stake and why 2026 is different from every year before it. We need to slow down and define the problem clearly. India is not facing one isolated setback. It is facing convergence. In the past, foreign policy shocks could be absorbed. A border crisis here, a diplomatic snub there. They rarely spilled over into domestic politics or economic confidence in a lasting way. That firewall is weakening. In 2026, trade policy will shape growth. Growth will shape elections. Elections will shape diplomacy. Each sphere now feeds the other. The Modi government could once offset external pressure with internal momentum, electoral victories, reform narratives, headline growth. But tariffs, sanctions, risk, and technology exclusion don't remain external for long. They show up in factories, in investment decisions, in jobs, and eventually in ballot boxes. This is why the question is no longer whether India can manage foreign policy challenges. It's whether it can manage them without domestic consequences. And that is a far harder test. To understand how India arrived at this inflection point, we need to step back and look at the longer arc of how its foreign policy and economic strategy evolved together. For decades, India's strategy rested on separation. Foreign policy was about autonomy. The economy was about gradual integration. Domestic politics was about internal stability and electoral management. These tracks moved in parallel, rarely intersecting. Strategic autonomy allowed India to avoid hard choices. It could buy Russian energy, deepen ties with the US, engage China economically, and speak for the global South all at once. Economic growth, powered by a vast domestic market, softened the costs of this balancing act. That model worked in a slower, less fragmented world. But the global system has changed. Trade is now strategic. Technology is geopolitical. Sanctions are economic weapons. And supply chains are instruments of power. As major powers hardened their blocs, ambiguity became more expensive. Multi-alignment began to look less like flexibility and more like hesitation. India's growth story continued, but it masked deeper vulnerabilities. Manufacturing ambitions ran into infrastructure limits. Technology leadership stalled at the design stage. And dependence on external markets quietly increased. What once looked like resilience was in part insulation by timing. That insulation began to crack in 2025 when a series of shocks arrived not separately but in quick succession, testing the system all at once. The first rupture came suddenly and publicly. In May 2025, a 4-day conflict with Pakistan jolted the region. It was short, it was contained, but it was revealing almost immediately after the diplomatic weather shifted. Relations with Washington cooled. Tariffs followed 50%, imposed not quietly, but pointedly. Punishment for buying Russian crude, punishment for failing to close a trade deal on time. Then came the signal no one in New Delhi missed. the United States deepened its outreach to Islamabad. This was not just about trade or tariffs. It was about trust and about leverage. The Modi government responded the way it always had, by looking inward. Electoral wins at home, economic reforms, new trade deals with other partners, and headline growth that still made India the fastest growing major economy. For a moment, it worked, but crises don't always explode. Some settle in quietly and wait. If you're finding this familiar, it's because this is how systemic pressure begins, not with collapse, but with accumulation. To understand why these shocks hurt more than they appear, we have to look beneath the headlines and examine the mechanisms quietly tightening around India's options. What's happening beneath the surface is not dramatic, but it is decisive. Tariffs don't shock an economy overnight. They work slowly. They distort incentives. They change calculations. The latest growth numbers were recorded before the full force of US tariffs took effect. That matters, because the longer they stay in place, the more they reshape trade flows, investment decisions, and risk assessments. And Washington is considering something even more consequential: additional sanctions on countries that continue doing business with Russia. This is where foreign policy becomes economic policy. Companies hesitate, supply chains adjust, capital looks for safer jurisdictions, and the costs begin to surface not in press releases, but in margins. At the same time, India's fallback option trade diversification is constrained. The European Union remains its largest trade partner, yet negotiations for a trade deal have dragged on and off since 2007. Deadlines have been missed, momentum has faded, so India finds itself exposed from one direction and delayed in another. This is the core mechanism now at work, a narrowing of options in a world that increasingly rewards alignment over ambiguity. And when systems tighten like this, the pressure rarely stays abstract. It shows up next in moments of public visibility and diplomatic theater. In 2026, visibility itself becomes a test. India will host summit after summit, an AI impact summit, the BRICS summit, possibly the Quad summit postponed once already amid strained ties with Washington. World leaders will arrive, cameras will roll, statements will be carefully worded. On the surface, this looks like validation, proof that India remains central, indispensable, in demand. But diplomacy is not just about who shows up. It's about where you are invited and where you are not. India's exclusion from the Trump administration's inaugural Pax Silica summit was telling. This was an initiative focused on critical and emerging technologies, precisely the space where India claims future leadership. Yet India was absent. That absence signaled something uncomfortable. That despite investment announcements and strategic rhetoric, India is increasingly viewed as a secondary player in the technologies shaping the next global order. Summits create optics. Systems create outcomes. And the gap between the two is now widening. When that gap grows, it doesn't stay confined to elite diplomacy. It eventually reaches ordinary citizens quietly at first, then all at once. For you, this convergence won't arrive as a headline. It will arrive as hesitation, a factory expansion delayed, a job offer reconsidered, an investment that quietly goes elsewhere. When tariffs linger, companies don't protest, they adapt, they shift supply chains, they reprice risk, and those decisions ripple outward, touching households long before they reach Parliament. In 2026, India will vote in multiple states, and elections are not fought on abstract diplomacy. They are fought on prices, jobs, and confidence. This is where foreign policy becomes personal. You may never follow a trade negotiation in Brussels, but you will feel the cost if growth slows. You may never watch a summit handshake, but you will notice if opportunity narrows. The government understands this risk. That's why it is racing to offset pressure through trade diversion, reform narratives, and diplomatic symbolism. But symbols don't pay wages. Systems do. If you're still watching, it's because you sense This isn't just about India's place in the world. It's about your place within it. And as these pressures build at home, their consequences won't stop at India's borders. They will reverberate outward, reshaping regional and global dynamics. The effects won't stay contained within India. When a country of India's scale recalibrates, the system adjusts around it, regional balances shift, global expectations change. India's neighborhood is already unsettled. Nepal has seen generational protests. Bangladesh is navigating political transition after the removal of Sheikh Hasina. Pakistan remains volatile, restrained not by trust, but by fear of escalation. Globally, India's ambiguity sends mixed signals. Partners want clarity, rivals look for openings. In Washington, patience with strategic autonomy is thinning. In Europe, trade negotiations drag on under mounting pressure. Within BRICS, India will chair a bloc increasingly divided between those willing to confront the United States and those seeking to hedge. This puts India in a narrowing corridor. Too Western to lead an anti-Western coalition. Too autonomous to be fully trusted by the West. The world is fragmenting into blocs, and fragmentation punishes fence-sitters. India still matters, but influence today is less about size and more about decisiveness. So the real question is no longer what India wants the future to look like, but which future the system will allow it to choose. The future now branches not infinitely, but narrowly. One path is optimistic. India absorbs the shock. A trade deal with the European Union finally materializes. Tariff pressure eases. Summits translate into substance. Strategic autonomy is recalibrated, not abandoned, but clarified. India becomes a reliable node in select supply chains, even if not a technology leader. A second path is muddled. Tariffs persist longer than expected. Negotiations drag on. Growth slows, but not dramatically. Politics absorbs the strain through rhetoric and symbolism. India remains important but increasingly reactive, managing decline in expectations rather than shaping outcomes. The third path is darker. Sanctions expand. Trade diversion fails. Elections amplify economic anxiety. A regional crisis forces a hard security response. Strategic autonomy collapses under pressure not by choice, but by necessity. None of these futures is predetermined, but systems have gravity. And once momentum builds, reversing course becomes harder than choosing earlier. The paradox is this: India has more visibility than ever and less room to maneuver. Which brings us to the final question, not about power, but about choice, agency, and what comes after this moment. India has reached a moment where ambiguity is no longer a shield. For decades, strategic autonomy offered flexibility. It bought time. It avoided binaries. It worked in a world that tolerated delay. That world is gone. In 2026, systems demand decisions. Trade demands alignment. Technology demands trust. Security demands clarity. India can still shape its future, but not passively. Not through optics alone. Not through summits without substance. The real test ahead is not whether India can host the world. It's whether the world is willing to build with India. In factories, in technologies, in rules that endure beyond headlines. What looks like a foreign policy debate is, in fact, a domestic one. Because when growth slows, politics tightens. And when politics tightens, room for maneuver disappears. The question then is simple and uncomfortable. Will India adapt its strategy to the system as it is becoming, or cling to a version of autonomy the system no longer rewards? If this analysis helped you see the structure beneath the headlines, share it. Because the next phase of this story won't unfold quietly, and neither will its consequences.